Well, we did stop them from destroying this little free software program. We did it by pure intimidation. We had a bunch of lawyers sitting around in my conference room in New York, and I said, you know, gentlemen, it is only because we're such good-hearted people, and because we don't really want to fight with you, that the geeks with signs marching around your headquarters on YouTube won't happen until tomorrow. And we settled today. Because nobody in the world is more afraid of user-created content than media giants. Nobody is more aware of the loss of power of media giants than media giants. They know that the idea of the ownership of the root to the eyeballs and the eardrums of people, which is the great asset of 20th century press, that route is now blocked by all the bullock carts and bicycles and two-wheelers run by us. Right? And they cannot send their trucks barreling down those highways anymore. And they're terribly afraid that the image of media is no longer in the hands of media, it's in the hands of us, the community, the people who blog and put stuff on YouTube. Right? Control of television in the 20th century centralized power. That was ownership. YouTube is commons, and it changes how propaganda works in the world forever. You can point beyond music and journalism to the next great decays that will occur as commons production begins to compete successfully throughout the range of human cultural activity. Anywhere bit streams are the currency of culture, which is everywhere, commons will compete very successfully. But it isn't merely by competing that commons becomes an agent. It is also by demanding the rights of successful production. We'll talk more about this later today, I'm sure, but let me just point out that the trade law and the law of international finance that emerged from the Second World War was an international system of organizations that assumed industrial and hierarchical production. Ownership-based production is the primary subject of global trade law. How are owners treated around the world, and can ownership be given a less frictionful deal as reductions in resistance to ownership's activities are spread by diplomatic effort, multilateral and bilateral, around the world. But commons has claims against the international trade system too. Claims that have been entirely ignored for most of the period since the Second World War, as official political economy doctrine around the world was that only exclusive ownership makes progress. And trade law came to be about making progress by securing exclusive ownership. This made a little bit of sense in a world dominated by the United States. It makes almost no sense in a world dominated by India and China, which is the world of the later 21st century. Global trade law is going to be reorganized, and commons is going to be a major portion of its reorganization. At the moment, we look weak in that activity, as we looked weak when we set out to transform the software industry of the world, but we will not look weak in 20 years. Commons has the ability to retort against ownership, just as ownership had the ability to enclose commons. Resistance to enclosure is the great subject of English working-class history. The greatest of the English working-class historians of the last 75 years, Edward Thompson, made his career out of teaching and lecturing and writing about resistance to enclosure. This is machine breaking. This is agricultural resistance, barn burning. This is the strike. This is the principle of contesting ownership's power. And you can't write the history of the English criminal law, a subject I have actually tried sometimes rather unsuccessfully to write. You can't write the history of the English criminal law without writing about the ways in which new crimes were created to categorize as criminal the resistance of workers to the extinction of commons. The law of larceny traditionally took the position that only felonious taking could make felony, and a party voluntarily entrusted with a good could not be said to have been a thief. This creates a difficulty when workers are given material for the completion of jobs in an artisanal production system. Think of a shipyard, for example. in which the scrap wood at the end of the day is carried home by the workers for fuel and for building material. And the assumption traditionally is that they are building together, the employer's boat, but the wood left over is their wood. When the employer decides that this is a form of illegal resistance, he discovers that he's stopped by the law of larceny. After all, he gave the wood to his employers, and if they take it home at the end of the day, they can't be stealing. This is the origin of the principle of the felony of embezzlement in 18th century English law, a crime which didn't require that the employee have feloniously taken. He converted to his own use that with which he was entrusted by the employer. And it was Edward and his students who pointed out that the history of the criminal law there bears a monumental witness to the principle of the extinction of commons production and the criminalization of worker resistance. Some years ago, as you may recall, a Russian graduate student came to the United States to give a paper about his PhD dissertation at the Consumer Electronics Fair in Las Vegas. He had discovered a mechanism by which PDF files that were DRM'd could be read by parties because the security of the lock on the PDF file was insecure. And Adobe had him arrested and charged him with a criminal violation of the Digital Millennium Copyrights Act, and he sat in jail in the United States for a long period of time away from his wife and child in Russia, awaiting further deliberations as to his fate. That was an early example of how geeks marching around a parking lot with signs, there wasn't even YouTube yet, had a significant effect on changing Adobe's enthusiasm for egging the United States government on to make a prosecution, and eventually Dmitry Sklarov was sent home to his family, told simply not to come back to the United States to give any more papers anytime soon. But you could think of that pretty much as an example of an attempt to build a monument of the late 20th century criminal law that would criminalize resistance to the exclusive ownership of culture. So we have in commons as an active agent for the transformation of global political economy two processes going on. You could think of free software as one and software patent breaking as the other. You could think of Creative Commons as one and the acts of resistance to the ownership of culture as another. You could think of the free software mobile telephone as one and the iPhone and jailbreaking it as the other. In each case, what you see is two fundamentally different processes intertwined. Commons both outproduces ownership and competes directly in the structure of winner-take-all, I'm a better man than you capitalism on the one hand, and Commons acts to ensure respect for its principles in a fairly elbows-out, bare-knuckle discussion with the principles of ownership on the other side. Ownership responds, as it usually does, by attempting to criminalize resistance, by using the weight of massed capital to swing against those parties who are attempting to undermine their principles in pursuit of the principles of commons. And we find ourselves, as so often in the past, in discussions in the courts. Not necessarily a favorable venue to commons, but the inevitable venue in contesting ownership's rights, because ownership's rights are delimited at the edge by the legal system and by its willingness to support any particular act of exclusion or ownership. All of this assumes one grand political economy fact, which has been a fact since the beginning of human civilization, which is that almost every human brain is thrown away. The great victory of ownership arises not only from the reduction of commons to property through enclosure, it capitalizes on the existence, the supposedly inevitable existence of ignorance. That is, the inability of human brains to coalesce fully, because most brains are forced into starvation for lack of education and an opportunity to work. If you think about it, that's the underlying commons. The great, unmeasurable, ungovernable, unboundable world of human thought. What the very same contemporaries in medieval Europe of the people who said when Adam delvet in Eve span, who was then the gentleman, meant when they said die Gedanken sind frei, thought is free. The great commons of human existence is the commons created by the uniqueness of human communicative capacity. We can think, and we can communicate our abstract thoughts to one another, and we can modify and share and remix and reuse thought. The primary method of enclosure of human thought is the perpetuation of ignorance. The distinction between those who can and those who can't, between those who have and those who have not. Participation in the common shared system of human communicative activity. Here is where the activism of commons will have the greatest unique effect in the course of the 21st century. Because for the first time in the history of human beings, we can actually make sure that no brains are thrown away. I go around the world and I begin a lot of my talks by saying to the audience, so how many of the Einsteins that ever existed were allowed to learn physics? And I watch as hundreds of people at a time think about that question, and they conclude that the answer is almost none of all the Einsteins that ever existed were allowed to learn physics. And then I say, you know, in our lifetimes, more human beings will exist than have existed in all previous time. So how many of the Einsteins who exist now will be allowed to learn physics? And I watch as hundreds of people conclude simultaneously that the answer could be nearly none, too. But it doesn't have to be. We have proven that we can use capitalism to drive into the hands of everybody in even a comparatively poor society an object of communication. And over that thing, even if it's as bad as a cell phone, even if it's as badly organized as cell phone networks currently are, over that thing we can put all useful human knowledge. Every form of science, every form of literature, all music, all art, all architecture, all dance, all military strategy, all business acumen, we can teach anybody anything, anywhere, anytime. Our primary obstacle now, for the first time in human history, is not how to get knowledge to people, it's whether we're allowed to reproduce and deliver that knowledge. We are one step from the primary activation of commons, which is the activation of the commons of the human brains. We are one step from there. Within one generation, we can accomplish it. The primary restriction on our ability to do so is the concept of ownership as applied to ideas. In other words, we are no longer struggling with a material reality. We can conscript the agents of ownership, desirous as they are of everybody's monthly cell phone payments. We can conscript the proposition of ownership for the purpose of ensuring the eternality of the commons. We have only a symbolic system to push against, the system of the ownership of ideas, which is itself only an idea.